The bitter wind howled across the frozen landscape of the American Southwest in the winter of 1872, carrying with it a lesson that would be written in blood and ice. A detachment of United States cavalry soldiers, bundled in their regulation wool coats and huddled around struggling campfires, watched with a mixture of amusement and disdain as a small group of Apache warriors began constructing what appeared to be crude, dome-shaped shelters from bent branches and animal hides. The soldiers, confident in their superiority and the protection offered by their canvas military tents, laughed and made jokes about the primitive structures being erected by their adversaries. Little did they know that their mockery would soon turn to desperate envy, and for some, those laughs would be their last. The Apache people had inhabited the harsh and unforgiving terrain of the Southwest for centuries, developing survival techniques that were perfectly adapted to the extreme conditions of their homeland. While the region is often associated with scorching desert heat, winter in the high elevations of Apache territory could be brutally cold, with temperatures plummeting well below freezing and sudden blizzards appearing with little warning. The Apache had learned not just to survive but to thrive in these conditions, and their wickiups, the traditional dome-shaped dwellings, were a testament to their profound understanding of thermal dynamics and environmental engineering. The soldiers, by contrast, were mostly recent recruits from the East Coast and Midwest, men who had signed up for military service with romantic notions of adventure and glory. They had been trained in conventional warfare tactics and equipped with standard-issue gear that was designed for versatility rather than specialization. Their canvas tents, while portable and easy to erect, were essentially nothing more than fabric barriers against the elements. They provided minimal insulation and did little to retain the heat generated by the small fires the soldiers were permitted to build inside them, and even those fires posed a constant risk of setting the entire tent ablaze. As the sun began to set on that fateful day, the temperature dropped rapidly, as it often does in high desert environments where the thin atmosphere provides little retention of daytime warmth. The soldiers retreated to their tents, still chuckling about the Apache shelters they had observed. They built their fires larger, wrapped themselves in their wool blankets, and settled in for what they assumed would be an uncomfortable but manageable night. The Apache, meanwhile, completed their wickiups with practiced efficiency, carefully selecting and placing each element of the structure with purpose and precision. The traditional Apache wickiup was a marvel of practical engineering that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of principles that wouldn't be formally codified in Western science for decades to come. The structure began with a framework of flexible poles, typically made from oak or willow saplings, which were bent and secured to create a dome shape. This dome was not arbitrary. The curved structure was naturally strong and could withstand significant wind pressure, with the force of the wind actually helping to hold the structure together rather than tearing it apart. The framework was then covered with layers of materials, each serving a specific purpose in the overall thermal management system. The innermost layer typically consisted of grass, bare grass, or other dried vegetation, which created thousands of tiny air pockets that served as highly effective insulation. Air, when trapped in small spaces, is one of the best insulators available, a principle that modern building techniques still rely upon. Over this layer, the Apache would place animal hides, usually deer, elk, or buffalo, which had been treated and softened but retained their natural water-resistant properties. These hides formed a barrier against moisture while still allowing a small amount of air exchange to prevent the buildup of condensation and carbon dioxide from breathing and any fire inside the shelter. The entrance to the wickiup was typically low and faced away from the prevailing wind, with a hide flap that could be secured from the inside. This design created an airlock effect, preventing cold air from rushing directly into the living space. Inside, the Apache would build a small, carefully managed fire in a shallow pit in the center of the structure. The dome shape of the wickiup meant that warm air would naturally rise and circulate around the curved walls before gradually descending, creating a convection current that distributed heat evenly throughout the space. The smoke from the fire would exit through a small opening at the top of the dome, which could be adjusted with flaps to control both the draft for the fire and the amount of heat retention. Perhaps most ingeniously, the Apache understood that surviving cold weather was not just about generating heat but about conserving it. The wickiup was deliberately kept small, with just enough room for a few people to sit or lie down comfortably. This limited volume meant that body heat alone could significantly raise the temperature inside the structure, and the small fire needed to maintain a comfortable temperature was minimal, conserving precious fuel. The soldiers, in their large canvas tents, were trying to heat a much larger volume of space with similar or even smaller fires, and the porous canvas provided almost no insulation to retain that heat. As the night deepened and the temperature continued to plummet, the difference between the two types of shelter became increasingly apparent and increasingly deadly. The soldiers' fires began to die down as their wood supplies dwindled. The canvas tents, coated with frost on the outside, became rigid and brittle. Cold air seeped through every seam and gap in the fabric, and the wind that had seemed merely uncomfortable during the day now cut through the canvas as if it weren't there at all. The soldiers huddled together for warmth, piling on every blanket and piece of clothing they possessed, but it wasn't enough. Inside the Apache wickiups, the temperature remained remarkably stable and comfortable. The multiple layers of insulation kept the warmth in and the cold out, and the small fires burning steadily in their central pits required only occasional feeding with small pieces of wood. The Apache warriors rested comfortably, conserving their energy and maintaining their readiness, while just a few hundred yards away, their enemies were fighting a losing battle against hypothermia. Hypothermia is an insidious killer. It begins subtly, with shivering and discomfort that seems manageable. As the body's core temperature drops, the shivering becomes more violent as the body desperately tries to generate heat through muscle activity. Judgment becomes impaired. A dangerous condition called cold stupor sets in, and victims often make irrational decisions. In the advanced stages, a paradoxical reaction can occur where victims feel hot and actually begin removing their clothing, sealing their fate. For the soldiers that night, the progression was relentless. By midnight, several soldiers were showing serious signs of hypothermia. Some had stopped shivering, which their companions initially took as a good sign, not realizing it meant their bodies had exhausted the energy reserves needed to generate heat through shivering. Officers tried to maintain morale and order, rotating men closer to the dwindling fires and organizing details to gather more firewood, but in the darkness and bitter cold, these efforts were largely futile. The wood they could find in the immediate area was often damp or frozen, producing more smoke than heat when added to the fires. As dawn finally broke, painting the frozen landscape in shades of gray and blue, the true horror of the night became apparent. Several soldiers had died during the night, frozen to death in their sleep or while standing watch. Others were barely conscious, suffering from severe frostbite that would later require amputations. The survivors, frost-covered and traumatized, emerged from their tents to see smoke rising peacefully from the Apache wickiups. The native warriors emerged looking rested and ready, having spent a comfortable night in shelters that had protected them completely from the same conditions that had killed their enemies. The psychological impact of this experience on the surviving soldiers was profound. Men who had been trained to believe in the inherent superiority of their civilization and technology had been taught a harsh lesson about the value of traditional knowledge and adaptation to local conditions. The Apache had not survived in their harsh homeland through primitive simplicity but through sophisticated understanding and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. Every aspect of their material culture, from their shelters to their clothing to their methods of finding water and food, represented solutions that had been tested, refined, and perfected over centuries. This incident, while particularly dramatic, was not isolated. Throughout the Indian Wars of the 19th century, there were numerous occasions when native peoples demonstrated superior adaptation to their environments compared to the U.S. military forces sent to subdue them. The military establishment was slow to learn these lessons, often out of a stubborn refusal to acknowledge that they could learn anything valuable from the people they considered savages. Regulations and supply chains were designed around standardization and ease of logistics rather than effectiveness in specific environments, and individual commanders had limited authority to deviate from established procedures even when circumstances clearly called for adaptation. Some officers and soldiers did eventually learn from the Apache and other native peoples, adopting elements of their clothing, shelter, and survival techniques. Scouts who worked with the military often served as bridges of knowledge, teaching soldiers practical skills that weren't part of any official manual. The evolution of military survival training eventually incorporated many of the principles that the Apache and other indigenous peoples had understood intuitively, though this knowledge was often presented without acknowledgement of its origins. The wickiup itself, while specific to Apache culture, represented universal principles of shelter construction that have been discovered independently by cold weather peoples around the world. The Inuit igloo, constructed from snow blocks, uses similar principles of domed structure and small enclosed space to maintain warmth. The Mongolian yurt employs felt layers and a wooden frame to create a portable shelter that can withstand extreme conditions on the Asian steppes. The success of these designs across different cultures and continents speaks to fundamental truths about thermodynamics and survival that transcend any single tradition. The tragedy of that frozen night in 1872 serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of hubris and the importance of respecting local knowledge and adaptation. The soldiers who laughed at the Apache snow tents died not because they lacked courage or determination, but because they lacked knowledge and the wisdom to recognize that their standard procedures were inadequate for the specific challenges they faced. The Apache who built their traditional wickiups and survived comfortably were not demonstrating primitive superstition, but rather sophisticated engineering informed by generations of experience. In the years since, this story has been retold as a cautionary tale in various forms, sometimes with embellishments and sometimes with attempts to extract moral or political lessons beyond the immediate facts. At its core, however, it remains a stark illustration of a simple truth that every survival instructor and outdoor educator emphasizes today. There is no single best solution to environmental challenges, and the wisdom of traditional peoples who have lived in an environment for generations should never be dismissed out of hand. The laughing soldiers and the quiet, confident Apache warriors represent a moment when theory met practice, when assumption met reality, and when pride came before a very literal fall into the frozen arms of death.